Recently, while scouring the internet, I came across this short article on GameRant.com that was arguing the point that the next Fire Emblem game should be an open world game. So naturally, as this is the internet, before even reading the article, I made a whole thread on Twitter and Reddit lamenting the idea of even proposing such a concept, and calling for the writer's job in the process. And in case the sarcasm wasn't obvious, I didn't do any of that because I'm a well-adjusted individual. Well, for the most part, that is. I still spend way too much time playing Fire Emblem and making videos on Fire Emblem after all, so, slightly well-adjusted. But jokes aside, I did think it was an interesting proposition and that this take warranted some level of examination. Which is why in today's video we'll be analyzing this article thoroughly and also examine if Fire Emblem adopting an open world model is a good idea or not. The idea of turning video game franchises into open world games isn't something new. I think ever since Skyrim, then Breath of the Wild, after that most recently Elden Ring, the idea that we should do X franchise into an open world game has been thrown around for pretty much every video game series under the sun. So it was only a matter of time before this idea came to Fire Emblem. It's quite easy to see why such an idea would be explored at face value. These massive open world RPGs I previously mentioned have all been financial and critical successes in terms of gaming. While Skyrim wasn't the first open world game by far, its massive scope and popularity at the time really brought the genre into the limelight. And ever since its first release, we've seen a boom in open world games hitting the gaming sphere. It feels like a lot of publishers and developers are pushing towards game becoming more widely open world. And while this craze for more open world games has given us some genuine gems like Breath of the Wild, I'm sure you can think of a few examples of franchises that tried to make this open world pivot with very little success. Whether the game wasn't suited for it or the open world was plain boring, there is one main reason usually why those games had limited success, and it all comes down to a lack of understanding in what actually makes an open world game special. Very often it just feels like the developers are trying to hop on a trend or simply breathe new life in an established franchise to get fresh eyes on it. And in part, this is what this article argues would be good for Fire Emblem. But when it comes to an established franchise like Fire Emblem, certain rules and traditions are important to not simply get a generic tactical RPG feel, but to get that unique Fire Emblem feel and that unique Fire Emblem DNA. And sometimes those factors that make games special might not gel well with an open world setting. So would Fire Emblem gain anything from going open world, and how exactly would an open world Fire Emblem function exactly? Obviously, the main aspect of an open world game is freedom of exploration, or at least very little limitation to your access to the world. And this is something that has never really been done before in a Fire Emblem title. The article mentions latest Fire Emblem games being semi-open world, and I personally disagree with that moniker, even of semi-open world. I can kind of see where the argument could stem from. We've seen before in Sacred Stones, Shadow of Valencia, Awakening, and more recently Engage, the ability to explore an overworld map, which does allow a certain level of freedom and exploration by doing paralogs or skirmishes, which can help you engage with the world in a more autonomous way since you're not beholden to going to the next chapter right away, as most Fire Emblem titles in the past have worked. Furthermore, both Three Houses and Engage feature a hub world that can be explored freely in between battles, where you can perform a variety of tasks from battle preparation to more social aspects. Finally, the last thing that could possibly be viewed as a semi-open world system would be the post-battle explorations that were present in Engage. But personally, outside of those things, Fire Emblem has remained a franchise that favors a more linear approach to games. And I want to clarify that all the elements that I just mentioned, I don't even think equate to a semi-open world. I think they all have major limitations that disqualify them from being strictly open world mechanic. For example, the overworld map only unlocks as you complete chapters, hence you are not exactly free of your movements. You can only go back to previous chapters or go do side quests. You're never really free to explore the map. Furthermore, it doesn't really allow you to go back to older chapter unless the game includes skirmishes of some kind, but even those are limited and never really guaranteed. The hub world of the Academy and the Somniel tend to be small in comparison to a fully fledged open world. Yes, you can move freely through them usually, but usually they tend to be more of a form of interactive menus than anything else, as the exploration of them simply revolves around doing various tasks to prepare for the next battle or engage in social elements, which would have all happened in a menu in previous Fire Emblem titles. Finally, the post-battle explorations of Engage, while being an idea I was excited for on the surface, ended up falling very flat in the game, as it ended up being more of a complicated resource gathering exercise that could have had potential as a way to see the map from another angle, or simply as a just precursor to an open world type of system, but it really did nothing for the game at all, except really just kind of waste your time and made the game feel more bloated than anything. So I think it's pretty clear to longtime Fire Emblem fans that within Fire Emblem's core DNA right now, there doesn't seem to be a strong basis for an open world system. It would probably need some major adjustments to make that kind of system work. And one could make the argument, and I think successfully so, that it could be a cool gimmick for Fire Emblem's next entry in its long storied franchise. As FE games from game to game seem to usually have a gimmick. Most recently in Engage, it was the Engage rings. Previously, we've seen Pair Up in Fates and Awakening, and so on and so forth. So each game tends to have its own thing going on. So it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that the next one could be that its gimmick is that it is an open world game where you can freely maneuver around the map any way you want and take on quests as they come. But again, how would that exactly look? I think it's easy to say this game would be cool as an open world. And it's easy to imagine that for action adventure games, as it tends to be the same model. You just expand the map to not have boundaries. When it comes to a tactics game, when movement is taking into account, where your units have 5 movement and that is an important thing to cater your strategy around, how do you make open world work for a tactics type of title? Well, the article itself doesn't really get into the minutia of how, but I decided to do my own research and try to look into it and find maybe an example I could base my own thinking on. The closest thing I found to an open world tactical RPG is the game War Tales, because there really isn't a blueprint outside of that game, in my opinion, for this genre. And I think War Tales is kind of the best example for this kind of game because it did it pretty successfully. The way it engages in the open world is more with a sandbox system where the player is kind of dropped into it, and you get to have a fully open experience in the sense that there is a region that is set up for you that is always the same for every player, but the way you decide to approach it is your own, as you have a generic band of unit who don't have any preset stories to go about, so you can kind of pick and choose who you align yourself with, what quests you do, what tasks you perform, and you end up just writing your own story as you go. Since the world will evolve around you with no set narrative decided ahead of time. And these things are pretty neat for that game. As I said earlier, I really enjoy War Tales. The premise is pretty entertaining. After a few hours in the game, I can definitely see the appeal. However, I must say that outside of the tactics-based gameplay, that's kind of where the comparison ends between War Tales and the Fire Emblem franchise. Since the combat encounters in War Tales are far more simplistic than you would find in a classic Fire Emblem chapter. The main crux of the tactical gameplay is more based around your movement, your range of attack, and the proper use of abilities at the right time. Using the map to your advantage isn't a huge portion of War Tales combat, as the combat areas are much smaller and much less complex than a Fire Emblem map would be normally. Fire Emblem in the genre is pretty unique, where the map design is a huge factor in why people enjoy these games. So having this more deliberate map design is very important for Fire Emblem. Not that an open world concept would stop that fully, but the reason a game like War Tale uses a more generic environment when you get in combat encounter is due to battles being random. They can happen anywhere on the map and at any time. So to not put the player at an obvious strategic disadvantage accidentally, you kind of need to make the maps a little bit less complex. If you would have an open world Fire Emblem game where combat encounters might be random, the player might just be dropped off in a huge map in a bad spot and then just lose a bunch of units because they got unlucky. And given a game like Fire Emblem, where a huge portion of the DNA of the game is the social aspects of the character and the supports, and also the attachment the player creates towards the character, being placed in those disadvantageous situations where you have to lose characters doesn't really feel good for a normal Fire Emblem experience. In War Tales, they get around this by having generic units. So while yes, you might get attached to generic Bob number 3, if Bob dies, well, you can always go replace him with Bob number 4, so it doesn't really matter if your unit dies. It sucks to lose a good one, but you don't have this connection that was intended when designing Fire Emblem with units with specific names and portrait in mind. And you could get around this by determining a specific combat map for a specific area of the game, and the player always gets dropped off in a designed position when they are in that area of the game. That way you allow random encounters to be more impactfully designed and more purposeful in the strategy a player could take. But then when you end up doing that, it kind of defeats the purpose of an open world in the first place, as you just kind of repeat the same map in one area over and over again. And personally, I don't find that extremely appealing for a Fire Emblem game. So personally, I think one of the biggest hurdle to overcome is the way you move around the map for an open world game. Because as I just highlighted, having you move around the map and getting these random encounters doesn't seem to work really well for Fire Emblem. And I think for obvious reason, grid-based movement with limited amount of movement doesn't really gel well with a open world system where your goal is to get around the map and explore everything. If it's done through a grid-based movement, I think it would fall to the wayside of being kind of sluggish and not very engaging for the player. So I think just from an exploration aspect on a map, open world and Fire Emblem already comes at a kind of a clash, in my opinion, because I don't personally see a system that seems to work well for a Fire Emblem title. Furthermore, while an FE game where you craft your own story has some level of appeal on the surface, or at least where you partially craft your own story has some kind of appeal, but when you start thinking about it, having a level of narrative cohesion to Fire Emblem is kind of what makes it special. The narrative experience of moving through each chapter deliberately with the design of the chapter in mind with the story, as you slowly learn about the characters, the world, and the plot, is very important to building this attachment to both characters and the games themselves. And as I've previously mentioned, it's why losing these characters stings so much in Fire Emblem, because you build that bond with them over time. Fire Emblem tends to already have a problem of making side characters not matter that much outside of their join chapters, so creating an open world game might exacerbate that problem, as the devs might end up over relying on the protagonist for conversations outside the main story, since it would be hard to know who the player has in their party at the specific moment or a specific place on the map, as they explore this vast open world where you can go anywhere and do anything and align yourself with whatever faction you want. And these to me all seem like pretty major roadblock to an open world Fire Emblem experience. But let's look at the article. What does it say about all of this? Maybe I can be convinced in some way, shape, or form. So the article brings up 4 points about advantages of Fire Emblem going open world. The first one being, it could result in more diverse environments that can easily be accessed at any point, allowing for a level of exploration that no other entry in the franchise can provide. So this point is a little vague. While it is true that it would lead to environments that you can infinitely explore, it kind of touches on what I've talked about up to this point in the video. The idea is nice, but the important part is the execution of how that would even work. With that being said, I don't think diverse environments are something that is exclusive to open world games. In the Fire Emblem canon, for example, I think one game that does a great job at creating diverse environments is Shadow of Valentia, with the dungeon exploration system, which in my opinion was an extremely refreshing addition to the game and created this diverse environment in terms of gameplay without having to rely on an open world system. This is one example, but I think there are better ways for tactical RPGs to create diverse environments and experiences without relying on open world systems. The second point the article make is having the next game be open world creates the possibility of battles taking place anywhere and anytime, making it one, if not the most engaging mainline entry. And again, there's another point I've literally just talked about. The argument lacks a lot of details to be convincing, where I personally think the opposite would happen. The map design of Fire Emblem, which is generally strong, would fall by the wayside on complexity to make it a little bit more homogeneous and simple to engage combat from anywhere without screwing screwing the player over, obviously, because you don't want to give your players a bad gameplay experience. I think once again, this is a case of the idea seeming nice, but the practice of it isn't as thrilling. I recommend anyone who likes the idea to play War Tales. It will show you that these types of random encounters, while fun, never found themselves as engaging to me personally as a classic Fire Emblem chapter. The third point the article makes is with player no longer being restricted by battlefield boundaries, it could mean large-scale fights that would not have been possible in older entries. This point low-key pisses me off, and I'm not mad at the person who wrote the article because they might not be well versed in pre-FE7 Fire Emblem, that being those who never made it to North America. It's ridiculous to expect people to know all the details of games that never got an official translations. I'm not going to be one of those guys. Although, the idea of large-scale fights has already been done in Fire Emblem. Literally the fourth entry in the series, which features some maps that take literal hours to complete due to their sheer size and massive scope that tend to emulate long military campaigns. So the idea that it could never be done before is a little ridiculous, especially with all the rumors circulating about FE4's remake. It just feels like the idea of large-scale maps could be expanded upon in Fire Emblem's next entry, and they can exist in a more linear setting, as we've already seen that be the case. At the end of the day, I think that conflating big and large-scale maps with open world creates a limiting worldview when it comes to game design. Big doesn't mean open world. Big and complex can also mean linear, as we've seen with Fire Emblem in the past. The fourth point the article makes is because of the increased variety of battles that can take place in an open world scenario, this hypothetical game might be the most strategic, especially when considering factors like enemy behavior and environmental hazard. Again, I am not convinced by this point. I feel like the word might does a lot of heavy lifting in this argument. Like, it might be the most strategic, but it also might not be. This is kind of not really worth talking about, as I already highlighted where I think the gameplay of an open world game might turn out earlier in the video. So there's a possibility that moving strategically through a giant open world with events popping up here and there lead to a more strategic game, but there's also the possibility that it literally doesn't. I don't really think that's a strong argument. Like, I would have liked the article to give me maybe a blueprint as to how they see an open world Fire Emblem exist personally. And the last thing the article touches on in terms of advantages of an open world Fire Emblem is the idea of relevancy. That an open world could propulse Fire Emblem into a new era of popularity, and sure, I guess the headline would intrigue people, but I think that using trends to sell games isn't the most effective methods. I think at the end of the day, gamers just want good games. And I know this sounds very simple to say, but the best recent example of that is games like Claire Obscure Expedition 33 and Metaphor ReFantazio. These games are turn-based RPGs, which is a genre that for years, literal years, we've heard people say that those games don't sell. Gamers don't buy turn-based games anymore. Blah, blah, blah. All this bullshit. And I think their successes has shown that this is just a lie. As long as the games are good, the gamers are gonna buy the games. The devs of those games didn't try to gimmick their way out of the genre to create something that would appeal to focus groups. They made passionate attempts at making games that would revitalize their own unique genre. It's not complicated. Just make something that is good and people will buy it. And I think even within Fire Emblem, we've recently seen this with Three Houses. While it's divisive within longtime Fire Emblem fans, I won't argue about that. It's undeniable the game was popular. It sold the most copy in Fire Emblem's history, and it did so by keeping the main elements of Fire Emblem alive. It did focus more on the social aspects of the game than previous entries, but arguably that is one of Fire Emblem's most popular features. All this to say that change for the sake of relevancy isn't always the way to go. Sometimes sticking to your gun and just making a good experience within the genre and understanding the genre deeply and the DNA of those games is far more important and will lead to the financial and critical success that these studios seek to have. And before I wrap up this video, I do have to acknowledge that the article does bring up the fact that there might be some downsides to an open world experiment, but they are not points I personally touched on in this video. They are other points that you can go look at if you wish. To me, they seem quite superficial in my own analysis, so I'll let you go read the article and find out the reservations of the author yourself if you wish to do so. But they did acknowledge that there were downsides to it. So if it wasn't clear yet, I don't think an open world Fire Emblem is a great idea. Sure, I want Fire Emblem to innovate with every entry. I want the franchise to remain fresh, and I want to be excited about new releases and new features. But I don't want the franchise to lose its DNA, to forego what makes it special in favor of some cheap marketing buzz. And with that being said, I'm in favor of Fire Emblem having maybe less linearity. You've watched some of my videos and streams, you know I love overworld maps in RPGs. I want Fire Emblem to keep that stuff in and add more additional side quests and paralogs and things to do other than just the main story, which are things that can maybe make the game feel less structurally rigid. I would like to see maps with multiple objectives that force the player to choose between two different targets and reward. Maybe a map where you can only save one of two units. Maybe a map where you can only save one of two castles, one of two nations. You can only get one of two rewards, or you have to make decisions as the player. I think that would fit Fire Emblem narratively great because it's already been done to some extent in older titles, such as more route split options that spice up the gameplay and up the replayability of the games, and maybe more choice in the units player have access to. I am not diametrically opposed to the idea of Fire Emblem letting go of a little bit of its linearity or features that force the player to shape a portion of their own experience. I would actually kind of love that. I just think that there are ways to do this that fit Fire Emblem itself better than just simply going the boring old open world route we've seen with literally every franchise under the sun in the past 5 to 10 years. I also want to make it clear that I didn't make this video to shit on the person who wrote the article. While I disagree with them fundamentally and their arguments are not convincing to me, I love that they threw out the idea because it opens up discussion and dialogue about what is next for Fire Emblem, and I love this fucking franchise, guys. And right now, Fire Emblem fans are just in a weird holding patterns. We have rumors of an FE4 remake. We have rumors of an X entry. We have nothing. We have Nintendo Directs with no trailers. We have Nintendo stonewalling us literally right now. So there's really nothing we know going forward of what's going to happen with Fire Emblem. So the next best thing we have, other than waiting for another game to be announced, is sparking these discussion together as a fan base. So I open the dialogue to you next, the viewer. Whether you agree or disagree with me, let me know your thoughts in the comment. Maybe there's something I missed. Maybe there's something I didn't think about. Maybe you have a pretty creative idea of how an open world Fire Emblem game could function that I might vibe with. Let me know in your comments. Let me know down below on this video. And if you're a content creator watching this, I encourage you to make your own video on the subject. Let's have a discussion about it. And while we wait for the next Fire Emblem game to be announced, let's spruce up the Fire Emblem discussions that are interesting. Because right now, we're all just waiting. So let's talk about it, shall we? Anyways, that will be it for me today. Don't forget to like the video if you thought it was insightful or you enjoyed it. Consider becoming a member by hitting the join button below, as it helps me keep this channel alive. Get a bunch of cool perks, emotes, badges, early videos, all of that. Press the join button below. On the topic of members, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all my tier 2 and 3 members right now. Those being Brawler 456, Forgotten Fox, Hirame, Case, Iron Wolf, No, Storm Eagle CH, Black Rose 32, Rogue Arcadia, Stylish, A Grumpy Bear, and Reploid 0. Thank you all for your support. And thank you all for watching this video. I'll see you all in the next video. For now, that's it for me. Bye-bye.